that's okay, because most of the advice and suggestions here are equally, sometimes more applicable to a career outside of academia. I do about the same amount of mentoring inside and outside of academia, so industry, government roles. And a lot of these are general principles of I guess, having an effective and happy career. All right, and there's the disclaimer that this is me with my personal opinion hat on. It's all very general information. If you want to heckle me or discuss, I'm very happy to do that in the question time. All right, so I guess it is important to take a note to deliberately call out the fact that it is a pretty high period of high stress in academia, especially for PhDs and early career researchers. If you're thinking about the future, it can sometimes be a little bit stressful, and I will be talking about the future today in terms of career planning. And the key thing to remember here is all of the advice here is just my opinion, but more importantly, none of my advice is an absolute. You could do the polar opposite of every single thing I suggest today and have an amazing career. And if you do that, please come back and rub my nose in it in 5 or 10 years, and I'll modify the version of the talk I'm giving there. Everything is just in terms of probabilities and likelihoods. None of this is definitive or absolute. And that goes for pretty much all the advice you'll get from anyone you talk to. And it's not advice primarily drawn from my own career. It's advice drawn from, I guess, the collective experience of literally hundreds of peers and colleagues and students and people senior to myself. That's what I'm presenting today. And I'm definitely not implying you should follow a path that's anywhere related to mine. I think it's really important to note that whenever you talk to mentors or advisors, they have their own experience. Your experience will be different to theirs. You get to pick and choose the bits that really resonate with what you want to do in your career. So, my career, I have been in academia about 20 years. I was born and bred in Brisbane. I did a Bachelor of Engineering, Mechanical and Space at UQ, the other university that we occasionally mention in Brisbane, and did a PhD in robotics, and then went through a range of typical sort of research roles before landing an academic role at QT 11 years ago. Seems like a lifetime ago, but it was only 11 years ago. And I sort of progressed up through the ranks, was part of a bunch of centers, and currently I've got those positions at the bottom, which Essa already mentioned. Whenever you see someone do a brief summary like this, it goes without saying that the number of rejections and failures throughout this list is much, much longer. I would present the 10 or 20 slides worth of that, but it would just be an exercise in pain and frustration. But it is important to mention that behind any glossy profile, there is a lot of rejection. All right, so let's set the scene. This part is a little bit more related to academia in order to help you make the best decisions about whether you want to stay anywhere near academia or go off into the world of industry and government and startups. So first, with the positive, I'm still in academia, not from a lack of really enticing opportunity outside academia, but because academia has some unique, awesome advantages. I get to explore, and my team gets to explore fundamental questions which we find fascinating in the research space, and there's very few other roles around the world I could do that with the autonomy that I get to do it in academia. This one is a little out of date in terms of traveling the world, but hopefully travel will gradually get back to normal, and it really is an amazing pro for academia. You get to go to conferences, you get to collaborate with people overseas. You really get a sort of great exposure to the world. You get to work with industry and government and startups and NGOs on projects that have real significance for society, for industry, for government, and that have the potential to really positively benefit people's lives. And that can be extremely fulfilling. If you are interested in trying to make things better, academia is one of the few places where you're regarded still as a relatively objective advisor. Obviously, no one's ever free of personal biases and subconscious biases, but compared to someone who works as a CEO of a startup, for example, academics are generally regarded as being pretty objective. And that means you get asked a lot for your opinion, and you get the chance to really provide input on really important issues. which is great. And probably the best part is you get to work with really fascinating, amazing people. And that is a big part of what I think draws many people into work every day. But there are issues, right? So in academia, this thing called COVID came along 2.5 years ago. I saw on my news timeline, which just blows my mind that it was 2.5 years ago that this all started. And what it really has done is it's really reset expectations of what a potential academic career might be. So the model that was in place for many, many years that you sort of, if you choose to go into academia, you sort of get some research positions and eventually you become a tenured academic. And tenure is the golden thing that everyone goes for because you've got guaranteed job security for life, at least in the American system. That is much less the case nowadays in Australia. Tenure is some security, but it's by no means a lifelong job. And realistically, no one is going to stay in the same job, even in academia, for the 40 or 50 years that they're working. It's a very dynamic, exciting, but also challenging place to be. Hopefully, and people are working on this, you'll be able to move between universities, industry, startups, and the public sector, so government roles, much more easily. It's getting better, but there's still a cost to shifting between these sectors, but it's a lot better than it was maybe 10 years ago. If you're interested in the research side of things, one of the things that COVID has made really, really clear, people knew this before, but it became much clearer, is that almost all of the research that universities do in Australia loses the university money. And teaching is the way by which almost all the universities earn money. And that is true even for mega successful universities overseas. The actual amount of money that they earn from commercialization in industry is surprisingly small or even negative. That doesn't mean research is dead. Research still has a very important role, but it's going to be treated much more carefully, I think, moving forward in terms of what is supported. And you can see governments starting to prioritize which areas they fund, which is good for some people and not so good for other people who want to do research. They're trying to make research funding and research much more tied to impact. That's overall probably a good move. You want the research that universities do to have some potential benefit, but at the same time, you do need fundamental blue sky research. A lot of the biggest discoveries of the last 100 years have come from pretty much open-ended fundamental research. So you do still need a balance for that. And so everyone is watching this space carefully. And so I've already talked about this. Research doesn't directly earn the university a lot of profit, but it indirectly helps massively with the university's reputation. That helps the university get more students and more higher quality students, and that then earns the university money. So it's sort of research generates, I think, what we call indirect income. But when I win a grant or one of my colleagues wins a grant, we know that by winning that grant, we have in effect cost the university some money because the university will have to spend a chunk of money managing that grant and providing the buildings and infrastructure. Research isn't what we call fully costed in Australia. Fully costed means all the indirect costs are basically covered. And that makes research really expensive. And a system that is closer to that is something like the US system. All right. So that's the context, that's the big picture. That was a very brief one slide about me. I'm going to go into some of the key concepts and issues that have been really formative in my career, but more especially the careers of sort of hundreds of people I know. And as I said, I will stop and pause and ask questions. I'm just checking the chat. No questions there. All right, fantastic. All right, so the most important thing, and this doesn't matter where your career is, mentors and advisors. And so I have quite a bit to say on this just to try and sort of help you find and vet mentors and get the best advice and best experience from them. So when you're talking to mentors, and I'd be interested to knowing how many of you have formal or informal mentors at this sort of early stage in your career. The number one thing that I've seen work really well is to find mentors who are very much self-aware and introspective. So these are people who have spent a lot of time thinking about their own careers, realizing that there was a lot of random, I don't say luck, there's a lot of random chance involved in their careers, and avoiding, like the plague, people who say, I did it this way, and therefore it's the way that you should do it. I think people do it in a well-meaning manner, but it is very, very, very bad advice. And a good mentor will realize that times are changing really rapidly. So advice, cookie cutter advice that was given even 3 or 4 years ago, some of that advice is still very relevant, and some of it will be completely inappropriate now, especially in fast-moving domains like academia. Even at an early stage, it's very hard to find a single, what you call an Uber mentor. So an Uber mentor would be someone who shares your attitudes about starting a family, about commercialization, about research, about teaching, about doing social good. You are not going to find that it's going to be very hard to find that in one person. And so one suggestion is you have multiple mentors, and a lot of them can be informal, and you make up that Uber mentor in the aggregate, so to speak. And so you have different mentors you go to for different issues. A good mentor, and to land a good mentor, you can contribute back to the mentor. So that mentor will be more out of touch with the realities of what you're facing and what you're thinking about. So if you can share, as you share your sort of thoughts and ideas about what you're going to do next, you are contributing to that mentor's ability to mentor you and others that they mentor. And you'll be more likely to land a good mentor if you can show that you can contribute to them. Mentoring is something that I recommend you're always on the lookout for. It could be when you're walking your dog, it could be at a coffee, at a conference. Always be on the lookout for people who just you resonate with and who you might be able to ask for help. People are pretty receptive if you ask them for advice. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It could be a coffee every 6 months. And you can mentor others. And by mentoring others, like you could mentor, if you're a PhD student, you could mentor final year undergraduate students or more junior PhDs. And it's like teaching something. By mentoring other people, you understand more about how you can get the best benefits from finding a mentor. Just when thinking back to a lot of the things that I was told, I came to talks like this when I was during my PhD and early career. One of the things you'll hear a lot is this fable of someone who has suffered great adversity and persevered, and over 10 or 15 years has finally made it. And whatever making it can mean lots of different things depending on the career. And these can be incredibly inspirational stories, like some people have overcome the most tremendous personal barriers. But whenever you hear one of these stories, the other thing to remember is just because someone eventually makes it doesn't necessarily mean that they made the right choice. People who are motivated and ambitious and want to contribute to society or change the world, there are a lot of options for how you do that. And if you spend 10 or 15 years of your life in constant frustration and rejection and disappointment, those are years that you won't get back. You'll learn a lot from that process, but it is possible that there would be something else you could do that would more immediately sort of match with your principles and values. And that's something I always recommend to people. There are lots of these inspirational sort of TED style talks out there, but at the same time, just because someone did eventually succeed doesn't mean it was the right choice. And that's something to always think about. Mentors, lots of benefits. They will sponsor you, they'll write reference letters for you. These are all obvious benefits. For me and for many other people I've seen work best with mentors, the number one value of a really good mentor is the ability for them to give you sometimes really critical, really confronting feedback in a place of safety, so to speak. So what I mean by that is you'll get this feedback, and it won't happen very often because hopefully you'll be doing the right thing most of the time. And it'll be really confronting. It will sort of make you question yourself, your identity, what you're doing, whether you've got it all wrong. But because it's coming from someone who you trust, who you respect, you'll be able to take it on board in a sort of private, safe environment. And when I look at people's careers who keep progressing or don't, the number one reason that people stop growing and developing is because they stop getting proper, critical, constructive feedback from others. And it takes a lot of energy to do so. You have to be in a relatively secure mental state to do it, but it is probably the number one thing to continuing to develop your skill set. Hopefully it's not so relevant to you early in your career, but as you get further through your career, it can be very tempting to sort of just sit back and rest on your laurels. And that's something I advise people not to do. Burnout. So I assume everyone here, I would like to hear if anyone has had a seamless PhD without any stresses whatsoever. But burnout is a common issue. This is one example from during my early postdoc, so just after my PhD. We had a sequence of, I think, 3 paper rejections in a row about some work that I was incredibly passionate about. I think we went Nature, got rejected, then we went Science, we got rejected, then we went Nature Neuroscience. These are all sort of prestigious journals, and got rejected, and then eventually got accepted. Each time required rewriting a manuscript from scratch to a different word limit with different figure requirements. And this is not an uncommon thing. People often have to go through several rounds of resubmission, often to different journals. And dealing with this can be really, really traumatic, and can take a real chunk out of your energy and emotional reserves. So one of the things I did, and I was very fortunate, I realized a lot of people can't do this, but at this time we'd been long due for a holiday. And so I went and ate chocolate and drank wine for 4 or 5 weeks overseas and didn't think about work. And it sounds like a cliche, but I was literally sitting on the Mediterranean coast looking out at the sunset one night. And I realized I had an epiphany, and it's not a cliche, this is actually what happened. And the epiphany was just to care less. And ambitious, driven people tend to care and tend to be perfectionists. And so this was a promise to myself that I would just care less about things. And so I did it. I went back, and it wasn't a trivial change to implement. I almost halved the number of hours I was working a week, and stuck to it, whatever the consequences. That had a bunch of results. I was less stressed. I submitted papers, whatever you're doing, whatever activities you're doing. I submitted stuff that I knew wasn't perfect deliberately. I submitted papers that had a spelling mistake in it without having corrected it deliberately. That sounds like a horrible thing to do, but if you're a perfectionist and you really struggle to let go, sometimes you have to take drastic measures to break yourself out of it. And in this case, and of course, I haven't done this study 10 times with 10 different people, but I'm pretty certain that this had hugely beneficial impacts on my productivity, my state of mind, and a number of other things. And I guess the key thing to note is my productivity went up, not my productivity per hour worked. The total productivity from a week of work went up, even though I was working significantly less hours. And this is one of the things, once again, these are if you summarize what I say to someone else, they'll say, well, of course, that's obvious. Why is he talking to you about this? But you always have a choice, right? Whenever you say, I have to do this, that is completely not true. You don't have to do anything. No one's physically holding a gun to your head. But your choice on what to do will have consequences. And that's what you mean when you say, I have to do something. I have to submit this, otherwise, blah, blah, blah will happen. One thing I've seen time and time again with hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, is bright, well-educated people, like everyone on this call, very commonly overestimate their ability to estimate the consequences of their actions. And so, for example, in this context, reducing the amount of hours you work per week, you may think it will spell the end of your PhD or whatever you're doing, but I'm telling you that that's not necessarily true, and that your ability to think your way through this and think what the consequences would be is limited. And so it's worth experimenting a little bit. Obviously nothing catastrophic or too dramatic, but it's worth experimenting to see if things that you think will cause the world to end actually will. And this is one thing that I found a useful exercise. Once again, these are, if you summarize to someone else, it'll sound like I'm just giving out really patronizing, simplistic advice, but to break yourself out of habits, sometimes you need to do these things. So at the time, I was basically saying, I can't do this, I have to do this, I can't do this, I'm too busy. And mentally, what you can say to yourself whenever you catch yourself saying this is, I'm deliberately choosing to prioritize this other activity over you. You don't say that to the person, but internally you say it to yourself. And then you sit back, you give it a minute or two, and you see whether this still makes sense, or whether you're just stuck in this cycle of trying to work without really thinking whether you have to do this thing now. What are the consequences? So the negative consequences, you feel you may disappoint people, you feel you may be setting back your career, you might not get as much income, you might lose your job, you might get sued. So these are some of the typical negative things that flit across your mind. But there's positives you think about. You may become more creative, you may have way more good ideas because you've got a little bit more mental space. As I said before, you may somewhat paradoxically become more prolific and productive in an absolute sense. You quite possibly will become happier, have more energy, and may have more big picture moments because you're not stuck in the weeds, sort of working on every fine detail all of the time. All right, so that's the first chunk of the talk. As I said, I'm just going to pause awkwardly until I get at least one question. I will answer as best I can any question, even if you think it's inappropriate. I won't say anything inappropriate, but I will try to answer anything as frankly as I can. So if there are any questions, please shoot. Karen, do you want to manage it, or should I just have to wait awkwardly until someone asks me a question? Karen, can you still see my slides?
I can, and okay. The recording is back on.
Okay, fantastic. Oh, okay, you're modulating it based on questions. All right. All right, so just a few more thoughts. So academia is a little like online poker. So online poker, a card game, is a type of game where in order to determine whether you are successful or not, you have to play tens of thousands of hands of poker before you get any statistical significance to it. And academia is just like that. You could be doing everything right, completely right, perfectly right, and just continually get beaten down by the system. And that's really challenging because the temptation is to go and change your process, but you may be doing everything right, and it's just the random volatility that's getting you down. One thing that I do advise people is decide on your risk appetite. So it's hard to sort of quantify this, but you may be really ambitious, reaching for the sky, know that there's a good chance of failure initially or rejection initially, or you may be very risk averse and you may be very conservative. And you should have a think about where you lie on the spectrum, because it will factor how you develop your career and what sort of opportunities you go for. This is the volatility slide. So let's say you're submitting, this could be a job application, it could be a grant, or it could be a publication. So let's say you submit a paper and it's a fairly competitive venue. It has a 30% chance of acceptance. So there's a 70% chance you get rejected. It gets rejected, you improve the paper, so you make it better, and then you resubmit it to another venue. And this time, because you've improved it, it now has a 40% chance of acceptance. The chance that the first time and the second time you got rejected is now still 42%. And if you continue this process, doing above average submissions to this venue, 1 in 10, just under 1 in 10 students will get 5 papers rejected in a row, not because they're not submitting high quality work, just because of volatility. That's the brutal reality of the numbers game in academia. If you talk to a professor or something, it's not so much of an issue for them because they have, I don't know, 10, 20, 50 papers going in a year, and that smooths out the volatility. But for a PhD student, you're submitting a very small number of papers or grants or fellowship applications or whatever it is. And even if you're submitting above average applications or papers, volatility means there's still a chance you might endure a bad run of, you can call it bad luck if you want. And that's something to always keep in the back of your mind. It's not because you're not doing the right thing, it's just volatility. And I've already mentioned this. This is the effort to output graph. This is also relating to the perfection. So on the horizontal axis, this is the number of hours you put into writing your paper or improving your CV or writing your job application. And the initial hours you put in massively improve your application or paper. But at some point, you probably start doing damage to it because you're overcooking it and you don't have fresh eyes. And the blue line is your ability as an individual to assess the benefit of you doing more work. And so initially it's obvious, you've got a blank page, you should do some more work. You should fill out the words in the paper or the words in your application, and it will improve the work. But as you get further and further forward, you lose the ability to work out whether you should put more effort in or not, because you're so deep into it, you don't have fresh eyes looking at whatever you're working on. At some point, you're really unable to judge whether you should keep working on it. And so that's where talking to someone externally, a colleague, a peer, is very helpful. If you are going to start applying for grants or fellowships or job applications, the more you can find out about the informal or unwritten rules, the better. You hear stories of people submitting 200 job applications and getting 200 rejections. One of the things I always advise people to do where possible is to try and talk to people who've been through the process before, or have been successful or unsuccessful, to find out as many of the unwritten rules, so to speak. You don't want to spend time submitting applications to things where you know ahead of time you have 0% chance. Because it doesn't matter how many you put in at 0% chance, you're not going to get any. These are some examples. Like one example is if you're finishing a PhD and you want to be on an industry grant with someone, sometimes there are unwritten rules that although you only need 50% funding from the industry partner, in reality, the grants that have been getting funded in this scheme have a much larger amount of industry funding. So it's not formally written, but if you look at past examples and you talk to people informally, you need to exceed the funding requirements of the application. And there's some other ones here around promotion for future jobs. And then, of course, there's a whole heap of unconscious or even conscious, unfortunately, bias across a number of dimensions in the existing system. This is a slide I put in just to try and prevent a lot of heartache. So this sounds really paradoxical and confusing, right? But early success in your career can be incredibly devastating. People focus on rejection, like rejection is the norm, right? But if, for example, you're an early career researcher, you've got your PhD and you land a prestigious fellowship, that is absolutely fantastic for you. But what can happen is that person, after they finish their prestigious fellowship, can have all this pressure to maintain that trajectory of stellar early success. And then they go through 5 years of absolutely brutal rejection after rejection after rejection. And somewhat ironically, having had no success sometimes puts you in a better state to deal with that than having had that initial amazing success, because you've had this success. Everyone's asking you constantly, what are you doing next? What are you going to do next? And then to have a rough period, so to speak, that can be really tough emotionally. So it's just something to work out for. That doesn't mean don't go for that early success, but be aware of this sort of not very much talked about phenomenon, which is that you then set up a lot of pressure on you for later on. All right, academics. So if you do go into academia, so this is specific to academia, but you can do the same thing for slides. Here are some typical types of academic careers. So you have reclusive geniuses who never emerge from their office. They never talk to anyone. They publish one paper every 4 years, and that paper wins a Nobel Prize. That's the very, very rare reclusive genius. You have well-spoken fraud. So there are people in academia who have nothing of substance behind them, but are very, very eloquent and very, very well networked. You will encounter these people. You will initially probably be wowed by what they say. And then as you sort of see some of the lack of substance behind them, you'll start scratching your head. Know that these people exist. Don't let it bother you too much, but don't be surprised when you stumble across one. These are all the more conventional roles. You have teaching focused, you have people who are technician focused and more focused on the technical stuff, the sort of blue sky fundamental researchers, and people more focused on applied research with industry and government. You have all-round academics who do teaching, they do research, they do some service to the community. And then you have high-profile influencers. So as I said before, one of the roles of academics is to influence public debate, policy. And so some people are very, very visible. They're always on the news. They're always on social media. They're always the person that gets consulted on a particular issue. And then you do have sociopaths in academia. The synergy of sociopaths and academia is unfortunately very high. Some days people wish they could be sociopathic because it would help them deal with some of the stuff they have to go through. You will encounter people somewhat that way inclined. Some of you probably work in very tight disciplines, like a narrow, very focused research discipline. And some of you probably work across a broader range of disciplines and possibly across many different areas. So I worked in my early career and still today across robotics and I guess computational neuroscience. So one's a sort of biology field and one's a robotics field. So, and we did cool things with robot mapping and navigation systems, and some of this is sort of defining work for my career. One of the things to remember is academia is generally not very positive about multidisciplinary work. And so what that means is that you tend to get judged on whether you're competitive in one discipline by itself. And the problem with that is you're splitting your time across 2 or more different disciplines. So of course, in one particular discipline, you're not going to be as prolific and productive in general as someone who is just working in that area and no other areas. There are universities overseas where there are amazing scientists or academics who've worked across 2 very different disciplines. And when they go for tenure applications or promotion applications, they have to nominate the field in which they will be judged. And that basically discounts half of what they've done. So that sets a ridiculously high bar on whether they can progress in their career. It's not a reason not to do interdisciplinary research, but there should always be a reason for it rather than just doing interdisciplinary research for the sake of it. So be cautious. Branding, marketing, and PR, just so I run another whole session on this. This is, once again, entirely a choice on your careers. I'd be interested to know how many of you are on LinkedIn, for example. Yep, Karen is fantastic. Actually, yeah, that's where she was sending me messages. I remember that. So there's lots of ways to be active. You can be Twitter, LinkedIn, or if you're younger and more hip, you can be on TikTok or Instagram, etc., etc., etc. YouTube. There's a whole bunch of stuff around marketing and PR. You do not have to do any of this, but if it's something that isn't abhorrent to you and something that you think you could get moderately skilled at, it's a force multiplier, which means if you do a little bit of it regularly, you will massively enhance the opportunities that come your way. So that's something to think about. You don't have to do it, but definitely consider it. In academia, but also in other careers, career defining visuals can be very important. So if you work in a field where there is visuals or illustrations that summarize your work, those can be worth their weight in gold. So this is an example that I've used for 10 years in a number of successful grants and fellowships and talks. I would use this dozens of times a year. And so the idea is to come up with a visual that very succinctly encapsulates the problem that you're addressing or your solution. So in this case, the images in the left column are images of the same place or location in the world, but they look really different, right? And then the images in the middle column are images of completely different places in the world, but they look very similar. And so even if you have no technical background in this, you can sort of grasp what's being done here. And these illustrations can be remarkably powerful and useful. Let's talk about comparison. So you'll hear a range of opinions on this. So I just said not to care what other people think of you, but in terms of you looking outwards, comparing yourself to others can be extremely useful. It can be inspiring, and it can also be very harmful for your mental health. So it's a double-edged sword. When you apply for something like an award, it's very tempting if you are unsuccessful to Google the people who got it and go, hey, I'm better than them. I've got all these things and they don't have it. But just Google yourself and imagine whether they actually know the complete story of who you are as a person just from looking on the internet or Facebook. Most likely no. So it's worth a big pinch of salt, I guess, in terms of doing this. When you look at others, which I do suggest doing if you can handle it, be empathetic so you don't know the full story. In academia especially, a lot of people have other significant life considerations. So they may have a physical or learning disability. They may spend a lot of time caring for a family member, a special needs child, someone who's got a long-term sickness, or sending half their salary paycheck to support a family overseas in a developing country. You never, ever know. They may have trauma in their past. And it's surprising how many people in academia, for example, have one or more of these. It's something that should always be considered. You can also be skeptical. So they may be rich and just doing academia as a sort of passion project and not actually need the money. They may be very well politically connected. I don't mean explicit politics, just that they're very well connected, and that can give them all sorts of opportunities. They may not have family responsibilities, which some of you may have, or they may have a family but then spend no time with them. There's all these sort of different things. They could be just a horrible person, and many other possibilities. So a mixture of empathy and skepticism is always useful. Professional careers are never a level playing field. And so when you are looking at how fast you've been promoted or whether you got that nice job, you should always be aware that you're never on a level playing field. Other people have had significant advantages that you didn't have, and you have advantages, or some of you have advantages that other people don't have. It's just worth keeping in mind. One slide I will add. So you hear a lot people going, oh, I'm smart, I can do anything. And rightfully so, there's a lot of pushback saying that, well, intelligence is not everything. Just being smart is not enough. You need to do these other things. But I would say intelligence, the statement intelligence is overrated, is itself overrated somewhat in academia. And what I mean by that is not to say intelligence is everything. It definitely isn't. It's just a tiny thing. It's one tiny part of your skill set and capabilities. It's very easy to be intimidated by people you perceive as intelligent. But in academia, when you're sort of scratching your head about how some people have been so incredibly prolific or productive, they could be in a field where their raw intellectual firepower just means that in that specific narrow area, they're just much more productive in that narrow span. And it's not something to be stressed about because there's lots of other ways you can achieve the same outcome. But it is worth noting, like, so if I'm going head to head with someone who is just vastly more capable to me in some detailed technical field, I learned to not stress too much about that. I'm not going to be able to change that, but there are other ways I can bring value and contribute to the conversation. All right, so when you're developing your CV and applying for jobs or grants or fellowships or whatever you might do, one way to sort of simplify things to think about how your track record stacks up is into 3 categories. Below the norms for your career stage, at sort of typical levels, or exceptional, something that really stands out. It's a nice way to think in simple terms about the various things you've done. And in terms of where people will fly, the biggest bracket here is having a normal track record for your career stage. That's that big black line in the middle. Some of the things you do might be below the norms, and some areas you might be genuinely exceptional. The reason this slide is useful is it helps you think about what you should invest your time in. So if you invest a lot of time in slightly shifting your level of performance or achievement in this middle bracket, it's much less likely to make a noticeable difference to your prospects, because you'll still be broadly in this, you've done adequately, you've got solid track record there. If you do it the same amount of effort to improve something that is noticeably a hole or a weakness in your profile, whether it's communications or papers or whatever it is, that can make a transformative difference to your career prospects. And so it's really working out where to invest your effort for the maximum return. And obviously you can't invest your effort everywhere, you have to choose. Another thing that's very challenging in academia is, or in jobs in general, is you have to pitch yourselves, you write passion statements, vision statements, you talk about how good you are. Academics who are successful often are very good at talking about how good they are without sounding too arrogant. But at the same time, if you want to improve yourself and always be developing yourself, you also need to be really deeply aware of your limitations and weaknesses. And these two things are very much in tension with each other. You have to have this confidence and certainty, while also being aware of all the weaknesses. And this can drive you a little bit insane at times, but it's a good balance to sort of strike. All right, we're at 10 o'clock. Time for any more questions. We're 2/3 of the way through, so we should be fine for time.
I'm keeping the recording going for the questions this time. Let me know if there's any questions you don't want recorded, and I'll switch it off then.
I will wait awkwardly for at least one question. Oh, Owen, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm on my phone, so I'm not sure how it's working. Hey, Michael, thanks for your talk. I feel like I really appreciate all the messages you've been sending today. I've been taking lots of notes and lots of helpful ideas, so thank you. I feel like a lot of career advice that is available to early career academics kind of encourages us to buy into the sort of statue carving aspect of academic careers, that like there's a lot of emphasis on the ego kind of you're very focused on your own success and like crafting this image of yourself as a successful researcher to try and increase your chances of surviving in a cutthroat industry. And a perspective that I would really like to hear more of, and maybe it's coming in this talk, is also on like, you know, obviously all of us as ECRs are like smart, capable, privileged, hardworking people. And I'm also interested in having more messaging from people giving career advice and people in positions of seniority to talk about like the moral and ethical aspects of career planning as well. Like that, you know, that there's a lot of global crises which seem pretty hectic, and the IPCC report gives us 3 years to drastically turn the ship around and things like that. Like, I guess I'm interested in your perspective on, you know, to what extent is it morally incumbent on smart ECRs to use their powers for good, and how to kind of direct our energy towards trying to work effectively on human problems. In addition, obviously you need to focus on competing and surviving and maintaining your opportunities. But I think, you know, all of us have great power to do effective change in the world. And so, you know, what's your perspective on how we should be harnessing and directing that and foregrounding that in how we plan our careers?
That's a great question. Once again, something deserving of a much longer answer, but just two specific points to that. One is a lot of the grassroots activism and lobbying that is led by ECRs, HDR students. One of the easiest ways for them to make that more effective is to get buy-in from one or two of similar mind, senior influential people who will then support you, sponsor you as much as possible. It is possible to do this sort of activism, I'm using the wrong word here, but these initiatives outside of the academic system. So there's one junior academic in Brisbane who is actively campaigning against for-profit publishers. And I think funding part of that through income obtained from sort of activities outside of academia. So there's nothing stopping you from doing that. I think the real crux of the problem comes down to, if you go full bore at that from the very start, there's a significant chance in the current system as it works, you will significantly compromise your career opportunities. The flip side of that is, if you work on your career, the key challenge is not becoming too morally compromised by the time you reach a position where you think you can exert enough influence. And I think that is the key challenge that everyone faces. It's not that you can't get to that position of more influence, but by the time you get there, are you so compromised and have you forgotten all of those things that initially drove you 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years ago that you're no longer effective? And I think that's one of the key challenges. And I think it's that balance that you mentioned in your question. Okay, I'll just quickly go through some of the questions. So there's another +1 for Owens. How important is it to have a very tightly defined research area of expertise? All right, so I guess this comes down to what Owen was talking about, this sort of statue carving, developing your identity. So a lot of academia, rightly or wrongly, is very much focused on you as an individual with a very clearly defined area of world-class research expertise. People will say at the beginning of your PhD, by the end of the PhD, you are going to be the expert internationally in an extremely narrow area. That doesn't mean you can't be more broad-minded and work across a range of projects and develop a range of experiences. But then you will want to tailor your job search or career search or application search to roles and institutions and organizations that recognize that capability. So to give you just one example, we have an in-house engineering team in our center of research engineers. And most of those engineers, and some of them might even be on this call, are not the #1 expert in a specific area, but they are very good across a very wide range of areas, which means of the dozens of industry projects we have, they can all work across all of those projects quite well. And so that's an area where someone who's worked across a range of projects is much more appreciated than someone who is very narrowly focused in one very tightly defined area. So I guess there's not one path is better, but each path will influence type of roles and how you pitch yourself going forward. Josh posted the academic parity movement, which is in the link. And that's it for the questions. All right, I'll move on to the final part of my talk. Okay. So useful resources. So here are some of the resources that colleagues and I have come across in the last sort of couple of decades that might be of interest to you. And one of the things here that's really important to know, it's like talking to mentors. You're not going to agree with everything your mentor says. You may have diametrically opposed political beliefs to your mentors, but that's not the issue. The key thing is to take the key bits of information that resonate with you and not let the other things that you disagree with distract you. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So these are old books, right? There are many more newer books, but a lot of it is just rehashing stuff. So one of them is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Once again, read it, see which parts resonate with you. Feel free to criticize and discuss the parts that you disagree with or that don't resonate with you. But there are some things in there, some concepts I've put 4 here, which are particularly effective. So the power of perception is the first one at the top left, one which is you never know the complete story. I won't spoil the story he tells at the beginning of the book, but there's a perspective shifting, amazing experience he had that opens the book, which is very worth reading. The power of code interdependence. So even though at an early career stage, it's mostly about you, gradually working to become increasingly reliant and dependent on other people will actually help you and will help them as well. So this is a concept I know I struggled with early in my career. This concept of circle of control, circle of influence, and circle of concern. So things in the circle of control, you can control directly. Circle of influence, you can't explicitly control, but you can shift the dial a little bit. You can influence somewhat the activities. Circle of concern is stuff that you are relatively powerless to deal with, but is still of concern to you. And then there's that quadrant at the bottom right, which I'm sure you've probably seen before, the 4 classes of activity in terms of urgency and in terms of whether it's important or not. And the things that are important and not urgent, the top right quadrant, are the things that people don't do and should do more of. It's very easy to say that when you've got a busy timetable, but most people are directly hurting their career prospects, personal development prospects by not doing enough of the top right quadrant. The other book, once again, taking just the bits that you agree with, is the 4-Hour Work Week. So Tim Ferriss is a very polarizing figure in this community. But one of the points he makes is, I think, very relevant, which is people, and this can happen from a very early age, people get stuck in this mentality of saying, once I've finished my PhD, or once I've finished my postdoc, or once I've landed a tenure track job, I will then do the thing I really want to do. And of course, the reality is they never, ever do the thing that they really want to do. And then they're retired and it's too late to do it. Or maybe it's not too late when they're retired. But the key is thinking continually about what your dream life would be and constantly questioning yourself about why you're not trying at least a small part of it now. If you're just pushing it off, putting it off, that will become a habit and you'll never, ever do it. So he advocates trying it in sort of mini doses. So you take a few weeks off work or pause your PhD for a few weeks and you try the thing you really want to do for a little bit. That gets you familiar with it. And it also checks whether your expectation of what that thing you think you might want to do is actually what you want to do. And often it's not. And that's useful information to do to find out before it's too late to sort of tweak it. This is a Venn diagram about this statement, follow your passion. So there's things that you're really good at right now. There's things that you're really passionate and interested in, and there's things where the opportunity is. None of these circles overlap perfectly. You can move the what you're good at circle to slowly overlap a little bit more in what you're interested in by working on your skill sets. But even then, it will not overlap perfectly. And people often confound the two. They assume that the thing that they're best at is the thing they're interested in. There's lots of ways that this is significant. One is some people derive a lot of fulfillment from just achieving things. Whether those things are things they're achieving in the area that they're particularly interested in isn't as relevant. And so in that case, they're more in the top circle. They're doing what they're good at, which isn't necessarily exactly what they're interested in. And then there's some people who are just really interested in certain topics, even if they can only do it at a very small level or small scale. And then those people are more at the bottom left. And then there are people who make a deliberate choice, for example, in my field, to go and get a job for several $1 million a year working in a tech company in an area that they're not particularly interested in, but because that money will then set them off for life to do other things. And so that's another permutation. And yeah, there's just the warning of being cautious about just considering what you're really interested in and also considering these other factors to varying extents. Exploring other options is always important. So many of you will be stuck in Brisbane and won't have career options outside of Brisbane because you have family commitments. That doesn't mean you shouldn't explore what is outside of Brisbane. Brisbane is a very small sample size. You should look at options in other cities, perhaps internationally, see what they require, because it will give you some feedback on sort of what the criteria are outside of your very little narrow part of the world. If you're prefer to stay in Brisbane, but there's a small chance that you might move overseas or go somewhere else, then you can ethically engage in the interview process and go through that. And then once again, you'll get external feedback on what people think of you, what people value in you, what constructive criticism they might have. And often that feedback will be very different to the feedback you're getting from your supervisor, for example. And that's very useful. This is very tough. A lot of people do live paycheck to paycheck or even behind paycheck to paycheck. But academia, if you're staying in academia, one of the key things to success is having a little bit of patience in finding your dream role. If you have to take a job for money, then take it by all means. But if you are able to at least search over a period of time for your next role, because academic roles don't come up regularly at systematic intervals. They're very sort of spontaneous often. And so being able to make yourself open to being able to take some of those will give you more options. You can negotiate in all of your jobs. You need to know as much ahead of time by talking to people what you can realistically negotiate for and not. So let's say you're a Nobel laureate and you come to a university, there will be some things you can't negotiate, even though you're a Nobel laureate. They just can't do it. For example, they may not be able to pay you more than someone else because of an equity issue, where they're destroying morale across the org unit or something like that. But it is worth thinking about it. More realistic things are flexible working arrangements, partial working from home arrangements, maybe a lighter teaching load if you go into academia, startup funds and all that sort of stuff. The same applies for industry roles, although probably a little reduced in scope. Try and get it in writing. The average tenure of an executive who's signing off in your contract at university is pretty short. And so if it's just verbal and they disappear, your promise may go with them, unfortunately. All right, let me just see. I'll keep going and then we'll have questions at the end. Work-life balance. Some people like this phrase. Some people hate this phrase and say it shouldn't be used. There's a movie, once again, I'm showing how old I am. There's a movie called Heat, a classic sort of crime thriller. And there's a guy in it, Neil McCauley, he's a criminal. He's probably a sociopath, who says, don't let yourself get attached to anything you're not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. So he's basically saying, don't let your identity get tied up too closely with anything you're doing because it limits your flexibility. There's a more recent movie, Up in the Air, which has a similar sentiment from George Clooney. And you can also think about Gollum from Lord of the Rings. He gets so entwined with his precious, the One Ring, that he can't really separate himself from him. So while the people saying this are not necessarily the best role models, the sentiment is worthwhile thinking. So as you go through your career, especially if it's in academia, if you suddenly, for reasons beyond your control, had to give up that career and it just didn't exist anymore, would you be fulfilled? How much of your personal identity would just disappear overnight? Would you have other things that would excite or fulfill you that you could do instead? And would you be happy? Now, a lot of academics tie their identity inextricably with their career, and that's okay. You can do that. But the one thing I always say is to always be aware that you are doing it, because it can be very easy for it to happen. And then 10, 20, 30 years time in, something happens beyond your control, and suddenly you're completely lost because your whole identity and your whole feeling of self-worth is tied up with your career, whether it's research or teaching. If you do choose to sort of separate yourself a little bit and have some identity outside of your career, that can be very beneficial. It can paradoxically, once again, help your career, because now all the pressure on your self-worth is not put on your career anymore. There's other things outside of it, and that can be very liberating for your career. So it's something I think people should periodically reevaluate, is how tied up their self-worth and identity is with their career. This is the obligatory "I'm a human too" slide. Everyone should have one. So just some of the things that I do or have done in the past outside of work that keep me happy. And a lot of things you do outside work can benefit your work as well. Like I do educational publishing outside of work, and that has some overlap with my work, but you don't want that necessarily, that overlap, to become too great. Otherwise it might kill that passion project that you have. So these are all things to consider. Final notes. So just reiterating, to come back to the positives I outlined at the beginning, academia, you get to explore fascinating questions no one's actually explored or answered before, and that's pretty unique. Hopefully soon you'll get more opportunities to travel the world. We're trying travel this year for some people. We'll see how that goes. You get to work with government, industry, not-for-profits, charities on all sorts of things that can actually help society or help industry. You get to influence. So this is playing to that ego slide, but the building up of an identity, if you want to play a role and influence things that you care about. So in my case, that's technology. It's very fulfilling because your opinion is valued, and you get to try and steer public opinion or government policy in the right direction to save money or save lives, or whatever it is that you're trying to help. And you get to work with an amazing team, and that's I think what brings so many of us back to academia day in, day out. All right, so I know that was a lot of talking. I hope the question time broke it up a little bit. It can be very, remembering back to when I had talks like this, can be very overwhelming. Don't try to remember everything. You probably don't agree with everything anyway, but hopefully there's at least one or two points in there that, if they don't resonate with you, have at least provoked you to sort of put some more thought into it. So I think we have time for some questions. Oh, there's a Japanese ikigai concept posted in the chat as well, which I'll have to look up. I don't know that. But yeah, happy to answer any questions. They can be questions you don't think you should ask a professor. I'll try and answer them as frankly as I can. Oh, and do you still have your hand up, or is that a legacy from before?
That's a legacy from before, sorry. I do have another question though, if that's okay.
Yep.
Do you think that academia is a good choice of career location for people to be working on, like, urgent planet collapse fixing actions? Like, if you were, yeah, obviously it's very different kind of domain to be entering as an early career person compared to when you started your career as an academic, but do you think that is it where you would put yourself as like a 20-something now starting your career if you were trying to work on big problem fixing work? Or do you think there are like other areas in industry or government where you can be working on more tangible impact? I'm just curious if what you think about academia as like the place for smart people to be doing impactful things. Is a good spot for that?
So that's a great question. I guess what I'd say to that is it depends on which of those career paths is going to sort of, sorry, I'm going to use the word again, but resonate with you the most. So to give you one straw person example, if you went into politics or certain government roles, you are going to have to not not speak your mind on certain things. You are going to see decisions that you disagree with made, and you're going to have to cop it. And some people can tolerate that and are able to put up with it without it having any significant negative effect on their state of mind. And some people, it will just drive them absolutely nuts, and they will burn out spectacularly. So I think in my case, I like academia because I get to engage in those meetings. I get to influence stuff. I get to speak my mind relatively freely, but there is that core research evidence authenticity behind it. And I'm not saying academia is better than, say, government. I'm just saying they're different. That keeps me sane. I don't think I could just do 100% lobbying and discussion all of my time. That will be different for different types of people. For some types of people, they'll be even more on the spectrum of they don't want to spend all their time in meetings and chatting and discussing. They just want to get the research done that helps provide concrete evidence for whatever the cause that they're passionate about is. In that case, yeah, a research lab in academia or in an applied research organizations like CSIRO could be very suitable. So I think the number one thing is, which of these career paths are you going to fit into the best? Because you can have an impact across all of them, but how well you fit into the career path is probably the single biggest factor. Okay, there's a question from Joe in the chat. Yeah, transitioning between academia and public and private sectors, but that comes with a cost. Okay, so one of the jokes you'll hear Ty, cranky, more senior academics joke about is that there's no real thing as, they'll say there's no such thing as going on a holiday in academia, because people will say that they feel like if they take 4 weeks off, they're falling further and further behind, because for those 4 weeks, they're not being productive with their team. And there is, in the current system, there is some element of truth to that, unfortunately. It's not like a 9-to-5 job where you clock off for 4 weeks leave and then come back and there's no real adverse consequences. In terms of the costs of switching, it's not the cost of switching per se. Obviously, you have to get to know the new office, the new processes, the new bureaucracy, and that comes at some cost, but you'll get better and better at that the more you switch. The real cost or potential cost is whether the skill sets and networks and connections you are developing in the role are generically useful across all of your future potential career paths across industry, government, and academia, or whether they are specific to one type. Because if they're specific to one type of career and then you go in a different direction, you will be set back a little bit. So it's not so much the transition costs, it's what you're doing in your time in that different sector, and whether that's another buzzword, but whether that synergizes with what you might do next, which is the key potential cost. I'm just looking at the chat. Aaron again, what are impacts early career people should aim for? Yes, you've answered your own question. There's no fixed answers. You can look at others to see what the norms are, with the caveat that you don't have to be exactly like others, and that there is inflation. So standards are mostly continually raising. So like I share my fellowship applications with people, but what I did to get a fellowship 5 or 10 years ago is very different to what people have to do to get one now, for example. Okay, some nice thank yous. Thank you everyone for coming. If that's it for questions, I will hand back to Karen and stop sharing.
Michael, what an unbelievable presentation. I'm pretty certain that you'll only get really positive feedback from our audience today. We had 66 people in the session. I know that it's been super valuable. Michael, I'll liaise with you for your slides so that I can upload the recording with the slides with your permission. That'll go onto our HDR Blackboard site. And again, I'll give you the recording, of course, as well, so that you can use it for other reasons. Just a couple of quick points. This is just the first of 11 sessions that we're running for you this week. I come up next with how to propel your career in final year. And then we've got entrepreneurship helping us out with a pitch practice this afternoon on how to pitch yourself as a researcher. Some of the topics that Michael brought up were, he talked about find out what these roles are like from people beforehand. So we have resources on the HDR Blackboard space, and we do a workshop on informational interviewing. So keep an eye out for that one. It's super valuable. He also talked about networking. I am a little bit of a LinkedIn nut. So those of you who haven't linked in with me, please do. This is where I found Michael, because he talked about this workshop on his LinkedIn page. And I said, Michael, we've got to get you to help us out with this Careers Week. So connections on LinkedIn genuinely work. There's lots of other good stuff coming up. I'm not going to take the time. I just wanted to say a massive thank you. It's an enormous effort to tailor these presentations for different audiences, Michael, and everything you said. I feel quite relieved as the career educator in grad. Oh, good, I'm focusing on that. Oh, good, I'm not telling them the wrong thing. It's always great to have academics who are in our corner as HDR students and support staff. And you are one of the good guys, making yourself so available. We're just really grateful. That was brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I hope the rest of the sessions go well. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone, for coming. Hopefully I'll see some of you back soon at our next session at 12:30. I think I'm on. But thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. I'll hang out for a minute or two in case anyone's got any questions for me.